we had this deficit crisis, well, the debt ceiling crisis a year ago, and the Business Roundtable, the major spokesperson for big American corporations, which in the past would have come up with a series of explicit recommendations for how to deal with the situation, issues a 2-paragraph, vacuous, almost contentless statement, essentially saying to the President and Congress, please fix this problem, it's really bad, without a single specific recommendation. And to me, that represents an enormous abdication of responsibility. This is not something that the corporate elite would have done in the 1960s. They would have come out and said, here are some suggestions for how to fix this problem. There was something about the role of big business in politics that if you go back to the period right after World War II, the heads of large American corporations tended to be forward-thinking. They tended to be concerned about the larger society. And, for example, they were willing to accept a certain degree of government regulation. They were supportive of a certain degree of government amelioration of social problems. They weren't thrilled with labor unions, but they were willing to accept their existence and bargain with them, and they saw some advantages of having unions. And I think they were concerned with the larger consequences of what they did for American society. And so, in fact, the term they used to describe this was enlightened self-interest. So again, these people were not altruists. They weren't doing this out of goodness of their heart or because they genuinely supported liberal ideas, although there actually was some support for liberal ideas during that period. But I think they understood that for the society, for them to maintain their privileges, the society had to function reasonably well. And so they believed that it was ultimately to their benefit to address societal problems. And if you look at the contemporary situation, I just don't see anything similar to that. In the early 70s, a lot of big business people felt that the free enterprise system was under attack, and they felt they needed to fight back. What happened is they basically won the war, so you had these institutions, labor and government, that had acted as constraints on big business, and they were no longer acting as constraints because they were now severely weakened by the offensive that businesses had engaged in the 70s. But the paradox, the irony of this, is that having won this war, big business was now they now no longer had any reason to be organized. And so they started to fragment. They started going off their own way in their own individual directions, pushing for specific things that were in their own interest, but they no longer faced the need to be organized. And then in the mid to late 80s, we have an acquisition wave of unprecedented proportion. So during that decade, 1/3 of the Fortune 500 disappeared. And what that meant was if you were a CEO of a big company, there's no point thinking about the long-term implications of your decisions for the larger society when next month you could be out of a job because your company's been taken over. So the entire orientation of corporate chief executives starts to shift during this period. But I think a lot of them do believe that they want the system to keep working. And I think for the system to keep working, there has to be some kind of collective action.